The moment I put pen to paper, I knew there would be no hiding. The world was already watching. Every step, every word, every silence I left unexplained. Cameras followed me when I smiled, and headlines followed me when I didn't. People believed they knew me because they knew my voice, my face, my successes. They believed fame meant transparency, that being seen meant being understood. Didn't. What they never saw was how heavy awareness becomes when you realize your life has turned into a spectacle. How every choice feels like it's being weighed by strangers. How truth becomes dangerous when it doesn't fit the version of you people are most comfortable loving. I knew that whatever I wrote would be read through assumptions, dissected for meaning, judged for intention. I knew some would twist it, others would dismiss it, and a few would pretend it never existed at all. And still I wrote. Not because it was safe, but because silence had become more dangerous than honesty. This story begins in that moment. The moment when I understood that being watched doesn't absolve you of responsibility to yourself. When I realized that truth doesn't need permission, only courage. And when I chose to leave something behind that wasn't polished, rehearsed, or protected by applause. What I wrote wasn't meant to explain everything. It was meant to survive me. Because sometimes when the world is watching, the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth anyway. I remember the weight of the room more than the silence. It was late, well past midnight, and the house felt unusually still. Not peaceful, just paused like it was holding its breath with me. I sat at the table with a single lamp on, its light pooling around a blank sheet of paper that looked far too innocent for what I was about to put on it. I knew the world was watching me even then. Not literally, not through cameras or crowds, but through expectation. Through the version of me people carried in their heads. Whitney the voice. Whitney the triumph. Whitney the symbol. Every move I made was already interpreted before I made it. That's what no one tells you about fame. You don't lose privacy all at once. You lose it layer by layer, until one day you realize even your thoughts feel observed. The pen rested in my hand, heavier than it should have been. I had written songs my entire life. Lyrics came naturally to me, emotion shaped into melody, pain softened by harmony. But this wasn't music. There would be no rhythm to hide behind, no note to stretch when words fell short. This was just me. Unprotected, unaccompanied. I thought about how many times people had spoken for me. Managers explaining my choices, interviews editing my truths, headlines turning fragments into conclusions. I had learned to nod, to smile, to let other people translate my life into something palatable. But that night, something inside me refused to stay quiet. I wasn't angry. I wasn't dramatic. I was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Tired of being understood only when I performed. Tired of being loved for what I gave, not for who I was. Tired of swallowing truths because they made other people uncomfortable. The paper stared back at me, blank and patient. I thought about the risks. About how anything I wrote could be used against me. About how honesty, once released, never comes back unchanged. I knew how quickly words could turn into weapons when placed in the wrong hands. Fear wrapped itself around my chest. What if this made everything worse? What if this confirmed every doubt they already had about me? What if telling the truth cost me the very thing that kept me safe? The applause had protected me for years. It distracted people, softened judgment. It convinced the world I was fine. But the applause wasn't here now. Just me. And the truth pressing against my ribs, demanding space. I wrote the first sentence slowly, my hand trembling despite my efforts to stay steady. The moment ink touched paper, something shifted. Like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I wasn't writing to defend myself. I wasn't writing to confess. I was writing to be honest, even if no one ever understood it the way I meant it. Each word felt dangerous and relieving at the same time. I wrote about pressure. Not the glamorous kind, but the quiet kind that builds when everyone expects you to carry their hopes without dropping any of your own. I wrote about loneliness in crowded rooms. About smiling when your insides are screaming for stillness. I stopped often, listening for sounds outside, as if someone might interrupt me. as if the world might burst in and demand I stop. Didn't. That frightened me more than noise ever could. Because in that silence, I realized no one was coming to save me from myself, or from the consequences of being honest. I thought about the people this writing might hurt. The people who believed they were protecting me. The people who needed me to stay exactly as I was so their version of stability wouldn't collapse. I hesitated. My pen hovered above the page. I could stop now, I told myself. Tear the paper up. Pretend this moment never happened. Go back to letting the world decide which parts of me were acceptable. But something inside me had already crossed that line. I understood then that being watched doesn't just steal privacy. It tempts you into self-erasure. Into editing your own truth before anyone else gets the chance. And that was the one thing I could no longer do. Kept writing. The words came faster now, less careful, more urgent. Not polished. Not safe. Real. Painful in places. Gentle in others. Honest in ways I had never allowed myself to be out loud. When I finally put the pen down, my hands were shaking. The paper in front of me held something dangerous. Something that couldn't be unheard. I folded it slowly, my heart pounding, already aware that whatever I had just written would change everything, whether the world ever saw it or not. And as I sat there in the dim light, staring at that folded truth, one terrifying thought settled in my mind. The world may have been watching me all along. But if this ever came out, they would finally see something they weren't prepared for. I didn't tell anyone I had written it. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not even when the sun rose and painted the walls with a softness that felt undeserved after everything I'd put on that paper. I slipped the folded pages into a drawer, beneath old notebooks and half-written lyrics, like hiding something alive. But secrets don't stay quiet just because you close a drawer. They hum. They press. They wait. The world, meanwhile, continued exactly as it always did. Loud, demanding, relentless. My phone rang before I'd even finished my coffee. Schedules, rehearsals, meetings. A charity appearance added without asking. An interview request labeled important. Everything urgent. Everything now. No one asked how I was. They never really did. In the car on the way to rehearsal, I watched the city slide past the window and wondered how many people were talking about me without knowing anything about me at all. Fame does that. It turns you into public property while convincing everyone they're being respectful. I felt different that day. Not lighter. Not freer. More exposed. Like I'd taken off a layer of armor no one else could see. At rehearsal, the room buzzed with activity. Musicians tuning. Backup singers laughing. Choreography being adjusted last minute. It all felt familiar, comforting even. This was the place where my voice had always spoken for me. But as we ran through the set, something felt off. I hit the notes. I always did. But my heart wasn't following. The words floated out of me while my mind stayed somewhere else. Back at that table, that paper, that truth folded neatly and waiting. "Let's take it again," the musical director said. "With more feeling." I wanted to laugh. More feeling. As if I hadn't given everything I had for years. As if there was still a place inside me untouched. During a break, someone I trusted pulled me aside. Their voice dropped instinctively, like privacy was something we had to steal. "You okay?" they asked. I opened my mouth to say yes. The word stuck. That scared me. "I'm thinking," I finally said. They smiled, relieved. Thinking was acceptable. Thinking didn't disrupt anything. But the truth was heavier than thought. That afternoon, I was ushered into a meeting I hadn't been told about. Same polished smiles. Same concern wrapped in professional language. They talked about the future, albums, tours, image. Always image. Always trajectory. At one point someone said, "The public needs consistency." Need. I thought about the letter in the drawer. About how inconsistent it would seem. How human. How inconvenient. Fear rose, sharp and familiar. What if they find out? What if someone already knows? That was the moment I understood something chilling. My fear wasn't about the letter being read. It was about losing control over how it would be read. Truth without context is dangerous. Truth without consent is devastating. That night, back home, I opened the drawer again. I unfolded the pages carefully, as if the words might bruise. I reread everything I'd written, this time not as the woman who wrote it, but as the world might. I could already hear the interpretations, the speculation, the headlines that would strip nuance and replace it with certainty. They wouldn't hear my voice in it. They'd hear what they wanted to hear. My hands shook as I folded it back up. I realized then that writing it had been only the first step. Deciding what to do with it would be the real battle. I considered destroying it. Fire. Shredding. Clean ending. But my chest tightened at the thought. Because that letter wasn't a performance. It wasn't a product. It was proof to myself that I had finally told the truth without asking permission. Destroying it would feel like erasing myself all over again. A knock at the door startled me. My heart jumped into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hid the letter quickly and opened the door to find someone standing there whose presence immediately shifted the air. Someone from my inner circle. Someone who knew how to read my face too well. "You've been distant," they said gently. "What's going on?" I hesitated. This was the moment where honesty could either create safety or blow everything wide open. "I wrote something," I said slowly. Their eyes sharpened. Not alarmed. Curious. What kind of something? I didn't answer right away. The weight of that decision pressed down on me harder than any spotlight ever had. If I told them, the secret would no longer be mine alone. If I didn't, I would carry it by myself. And I was already tired. "I don't know what to do with it," I admitted. They studied me carefully, then said something that landed harder than they probably intended. "You have to be careful. Not everything needs to be shared." Fear flared. Careful. The same word dressed up in concern. The same warning I'd heard my entire life. I nodded, non-committal, and changed the subject. They left soon after, satisfied enough. But once I was alone again, I sank into a chair, heart racing. Because now I knew something I couldn't unknow. The letter wasn't just dangerous because of what it said. It was dangerous because of who might want to control it once they knew it existed. And as I stared at that closed drawer in the dark, a cold realization crept in. The world wasn't the only thing watching me anymore. Someone close was paying attention. And if this letter ever saw the light, I wouldn't be the only one deciding how it was used. Once a secret is no longer yours alone, it changes shape. I felt it the next few days. The way conversations slowed when I entered a room, the way questions were phrased too carefully. Nothing obvious. Nothing I could point to and say, "There. That's it." But fear doesn't need proof. It reads patterns. It senses shifts in air pressure long before storms arrive. I started carrying the letter with me. Not everywhere, but close enough that I knew where it was at all times. Folded, sealed inside a plain envelope, slipped into the bottom of my bag beneath makeup and notebooks. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. The same instinct that had kept me safe in rooms where smiles didn't always mean goodwill. Writing the letter had given me clarity. Protecting it gave me anxiety. During rehearsals, my voice felt stronger, clearer, like something unblocked. But between songs, my mind drifted. I watched people more closely now. Not suspiciously. Honestly. Who leaned in when I spoke. Who leaned away. Who asked questions that weren't really questions at all. One afternoon, I found my dressing room door slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed it. Nothing was missing. Nothing disturbed. And yet my pulse spiked. I stood there for a moment listening. The room smelled the same. Looked the same. But something invisible had shifted. The way it does when you realize someone may have crossed a boundary without leaving fingerprints. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment. The open door, the casual concern in people's voices, the warning I'd been given. Not everything needs to be shared. Who decides that? I got up and checked my bag. The envelope was still there. Untouched. Relief came, followed immediately by dread. Because relief meant I had something to lose. The next morning I received an unexpected invitation. Meeting. Informal. Just a check-in. That phrase again followed me like a shadow. I almost declined. Instead I went, determined not to reveal anything, but curious to see how much they already knew. The room was quiet, intimate. No lawyers. No contracts. Just two people I trusted or had trusted, sitting across from me, concern written neatly on their faces. They asked how I was doing. I answered truthfully but selectively. Then one of them said casually, "You've been doing a lot of thinking lately." It wasn't a question. I met their eyes. "I think a lot," I replied. "You've always been introspective," they continued. "But sometimes reflection can turn inward in ways that aren't healthy." There it was. The framing. I felt my chest tighten. Fear stirred, not loud but alert. "I'm healthy," I said calmly. "Of course," they replied quickly. "We just want to make sure nothing private becomes misunderstood." My breath caught. Private. They hadn't said letter. They hadn't said writing. They hadn't said anything concrete at all. But the implication sat between us like a third person. I smiled, the trained smile, the one that reveals nothing. "I appreciate the concern." They nodded, satisfied enough. The meeting ended soon after, wrapped in reassurance and familiarity. But my hands shook as I drove home. That was no coincidence. Someone knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to be afraid of it. That night I took the envelope out and read the letter again, slowly, carefully. I searched my own words for danger, for misinterpretation, for lines that could be twisted if taken out of context. There were many. Truth always looks reckless to people invested in control. I realized then that the vulnerability in that letter wasn't emotional. It was political. It threatened structures built on silence. It challenged the idea that I could be managed through narratives that didn't belong to me. That's why it scared them. I considered making copies. Safeguards. But that felt like escalation, like declaring war before knowing who the enemy was. Instead, I decided on something quieter. I would give one copy, not to someone powerful but to someone principled. Someone outside the machinery. Someone who wouldn't benefit from my silence or my exposure. The decision calmed me. Until the phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. "Careful. We should talk. There are things you've written that could be misinterpreted. For your sake." My stomach dropped. They hadn't asked if I'd written something. They'd assumed it. I sat very still, listening to the silence after the message ended, the weight of it settling in my chest. Fear didn't whisper this time. Spoke clearly. Someone had read words they were never meant to see, or was very close to doing so. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether the world would ever read what I wrote. It was whether the truth would survive long enough for me to decide how it should be revealed. Fear has a way of sharpening time. Every hour after that voicemail felt stretched thin, like glass pulled too tight. I replayed the message again and again, listening not just to the words, but to what lived beneath them. The calm tone, the careful phrasing, the assumption of authority. They weren't asking for a conversation. They were signaling awareness. I didn't return the call. Silence, when chosen, can be its own form of power. But it also invites escalation. By the next afternoon, the pressure became visible. An assistant mentioned, casually, that someone had been asking about my recent writings. A producer joked about how journals always come out eventually. A friend warned me, with genuine worry in their eyes, that people were talking behind closed doors. Not gossip. Strategy. The external conflict I'd been circling finally stepped into the open. That evening, I was called into a meeting under the pretense of clarifying misunderstandings. The room was different this time. Larger. Colder. No personal warmth left in the air. Just structure. They spoke carefully, as if every sentence had been rehearsed. "There's concern," one of them said, folding their hands. "That something personal you've written could be taken out of context." Again with concern. I haven't shared anything, I replied. That may not remain true, another voice added. And once words exist, control becomes complicated. Control. There was at last. I felt fear rise, real and undeniable. Not panic, awareness. This wasn't about protecting me from misunderstanding. It was about protecting systems from disruption. They suggested safeguards, storage, oversight. The idea that anything I wrote should be reviewed before being kept, before being shared, before being remembered. My chest tightened. They were asking for access to my inner life. Said no. Not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. The temperature in the room dropped. You're being emotional, someone said gently. We're trying to help. Help. I realized then how often help is offered only when it serves the helper. I stood up, hands steady despite the pounding in my ears. What I write belongs to me, I said. Not to a team. Not to a strategy. A silence followed, heavy, loaded. You need to understand the consequences, someone warned. If this becomes public, it won't be kind. I understand, I replied. What I didn't say was that kindness had never been the measure of truth. When I left that room, I knew the line had been crossed. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It was active. And it was personal. That night I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly for a while. The city lights blurring through tears I didn't bother to wipe away. I needed distance, not just from people but from places where I was predictable. I pulled over somewhere quiet and took the envelope out of my bag. My hand shook as I held it. The letter felt heavier than paper should. This wasn't just writing anymore. It was evidence of my state of mind, of my autonomy, of my refusal to disappear quietly. And that made it dangerous. I made a decision then, not carefully, not strategically, but honestly. I would move the letter, not hide it better, not destroy it, protect it. I drove to someone I trusted not because they were powerful, but because they were principled. Someone outside contracts and reputations. Someone who valued truth even when it was inconvenient. When I handed them the envelope, I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. This matters, I said. And it needs to stay safe. They nodded without asking questions. That trust nearly broke me. As I drove away, fear surged again, sharper than before. 'Cause now I had less control, not more. Once something leaves your hands, it changes forever. But so does silence. By morning, rumors were moving faster. I could feel it. Calls I didn't answer. Messages left vague on purpose. Concern turning into urgency. Someone wanted that letter. And they were no longer pretending it was for my own good. As the sun rose, exhaustion settled into my bones, but beneath it lived something else, resolve. I had crossed a point of no return. The world was watching, yes. But now, so were people who feared what I had written more than they feared hurting me. And whatever came next would decide not just the fate of those words, but whether my truth would belong to me, or be taken before I could give it voice. By the time the rumors reached me directly, they had already been reshaped into something unrecognizable. I heard them through other people's voices. Hesitant, careful, apologetic. Someone told me there were concerns about my mental state. Another said people were worried I was being influenced. A third asked too gently whether I was writing things I might regret later. None of them asked what I had actually written. That told me everything. Truth doesn't scare people until they realize they can't control its framing. I felt the pressure close in from all sides. Meetings requested and then cancelled. Invitations rescinded quietly. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt measured, guarded. Even kindness had acquired an edge, like it came with conditions I hadn't agreed to. Fear returned, but it felt different now. Not smaller, clearer. I wasn't afraid of exposure anymore. I was afraid of erasure. One afternoon I was called into another meeting, this one urgent enough that declining would have made things worse. The room was crowded again. Faces I knew, faces I didn't, all wearing the same practiced concern. They didn't waste time this time. "We know you've written something personal," one of them said plainly. "And we're worried about how it could be perceived." "By who?" asked. They exchanged looks. "By everyone," someone answered. That word again. Everyone. The threat hidden inside collectives. They told me stories. Cautionary tales about artists whose private thoughts had destroyed careers. They framed themselves as protectors. Stabilizers. As the only ones capable of keeping me safe from myself. I listened quietly. Then they made their move. Proposal. Formal. Neatly printed. They wanted access. Not ownership. They were careful with language. But review rights. Safeguards. The ability to advise on anything I wrote that might one day exist beyond my control. They slid the paper toward me. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. This was the true intention behind all the concern. Control the words. Control the woman. I didn't touch the paper. "You're asking me to censor myself," I said. "No," someone corrected gently. "We're asking you to protect yourself." The lie sat between us, heavy and obvious. I stood up. "I won't do this," I said. The room stiffened. "You need to think carefully," another voice warned. "Refusing cooperation will raise questions." "About what?" I asked. "About your stability." There it was. The weapon they'd been holding behind their backs. Fear surged deep, primal. Not fear of them, but fear of what that label could do once released into the world. I knew how quickly narratives solidified. How impossible it was to fight something once it was whispered in the right places. They were ready to reframe me if I didn't comply. I saw it clearly now. This wasn't about what I had written. It was about making sure I never wrote freely again. I left without signing anything. The fallout began immediately. Calls stopped returning. Projects paused. People I trusted suddenly needed distance, until things settled. I could feel the machinery moving, subtle but relentless. Isolation isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It shows up as empty calendars and unanswered messages. As being excluded from conversations about your own life. As feeling your world shrink while everyone insists it's for your benefit. Fear pressed in hard that night. I sat alone, replaying everything, questioning myself for the first time since I'd written the letter. Was I being reckless? Was I risking too much? That's when I realized the cruelest trick fear plays on you. It makes you doubt the truth you already know. I reached out to the person holding the letter. "Is it safe?" I asked. "Yes," they said. "But people are asking." Asking. That word landed like a weight. Someone had escalated. Someone wanted that letter badly enough to move beyond implication. I paced the room, adrenaline buzzing under my skin. I understood now that waiting wasn't neutral anymore. Time was no longer my ally. The longer I stayed silent, the more space I gave them to define the narrative for me. I had to act. But acting meant choosing between two terrifying options. Protect the letter by keeping it hidden, and allow myself to be quietly dismantled. Or bring the truth into the light, and lose control over how the world would receive it. Both paths carried loss. I sat down, heart racing, and stared at the wall as a realization settled over me with chilling clarity. They weren't afraid of the letter becoming public. They were afraid of me choosing when it did. And somewhere between fear and resolve, I knew the next decision I made would not just expose the truth. It would decide who survived it. The woman who stayed silent, or the woman who finally spoke. I woke up knowing there would be no middle ground left. The fear that had followed me for weeks, months really, had finally narrowed into a single undeniable truth. Silence was no longer neutral. It had become permission. Permission for others to speak for me, decide for me, erase me gently while calling it care. I sat at the window as morning light crept across the floor, thinking about how strange it was that the most terrifying choice I'd ever faced had nothing to do with stages or notes or crowds. It was about authorship, about whether my life would be narrated by me, or managed by everyone else. I called the person holding the letter. "I'm ready," I said. They didn't ask what I meant. They simply replied, Then we'll do this the right way. For the first time in weeks, my breath came easier. The decision didn't erase fear. Clarified it. Fear stopped circling and stood still, exposed. I could see its shape now. Loss of control, yes, but also loss of approval. Loss of safety in systems I'd relied on, even when they hurt me. That afternoon I met with a small group. Not executives, not strategists, not people who benefited from my silence. Just listeners. Witnesses. People who understood the weight of truth and the responsibility of holding it without twisting it. I read the letter out loud. My voice shook at first. Not because the words were weak, but because they were finally unguarded. Each sentence felt like stepping forward without armor, trusting the ground to hold. There was no dramatic reaction when I finished. No gasp, no judgment, just stillness. And then someone said quietly, "This is yours." Those 3 words settled something deep inside me. What happened next wasn't explosive the way people imagine revelation to be. There was no single headline, no instant redemption or collapse. The truth moved slowly, deliberately, like water finding cracks. Some people listened. Some dismissed it. Some tried to reinterpret it until it fit their comfort again. But it was out of my hands now. Not stolen, not controlled, released. And that made all the difference. The backlash came, of course. Subtle distancing. Professional coldness. Whispers that questioned my judgment instead of my words. I had expected that. What surprised me was how little it destroyed me. 'Cause something had shifted. I no longer needed their permission to exist honestly. I spent the following weeks rebuilding something quieter than a career, myself. I chose my days instead of reacting to them. I spoke less, listened more. I learned how to sit with discomfort without rushing to perform my way out of it. Fear still visited, but it no longer ruled. I understood now that fear had never been my enemy. It had been a signal, warning me when my voice was being compressed, when my truth was being negotiated away. The real danger had been ignoring it. I thought about how often people mistake visibility for freedom. How applause convinces the world you are protected. How admiration can become a cage when it replaces understanding. What I lived with behind the scenes wasn't weakness. It was awareness, growing louder until it demanded to be honored. I don't know how history will summarize me. It rarely captures nuance. It prefers neat endings and clear labels. But I know this. I chose to write while the world was watching. I chose to speak knowing the cost. I chose myself when silence would have been easier. And that choice didn't save everything. But it saved something far more important. My voice. Not the one that fills arenas. The one that tells the truth when no one is clapping. If there's a reason this story matters, it's not because of fame or letters or secrets. It's because so many people are living watched lives, edited lives, waiting for permission to be honest. You don't need permission. You need courage. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave proof that you were here. Fully, truthfully, without apology. Some stories aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to remind us what it costs to stay silent, and what it takes to speak anyway. If this story made you reflect on truth, fear, or the power of owning your voice, take a moment to sit with it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss the next story.